welcome back. This is the second video in a series of 3 on Google Forms. This video is some more advanced techniques with Google Forms, ways to incorporate it into your everyday practice to try to alleviate some common problems. In the previous video we went over how to create a Google form and go through the setting up the questions, setting up the response destination, etc. We're not going to do that in this video, so if you need some help with that, I suggest going back and looking at that other video for some basic tips on Google Forms. For these two examples, I selected two common situations, or you could call them problems, that I encountered in the classroom on a regular basis. And for each, Google Forms is a good way to quickly and arguably easily move past those problems and kind of solve those problems. So in the first here, I have a situation where I have in one of my classes a class discussion element, and with the class discussion element, I struggle with the fact that in every class you have a few students that are vocal, and sometimes it's a very few students that are vocal, and then for the rest of the class they generally are silent. So you can't really open it up to free discussion. You have to resort to things like calling on students, and then they give you a short answer that doesn't really forward the discussion at all, and for the most part the teacher is having the discussion by themselves, and there's not really much discussion going on. One way that I found to alleviate this problem is using a Google form to get students to respond to some prompts, and using those as a starting point to get some discussion going in the class. One of the reasons that I found this to be successful is the fact that I can set it up for the form to be completely anonymous, and students that are normally intimidated by responding in front of their peers, or especially if they're responding with an opinion that they believe is not held by their peers or is the opposite of their peers, and then may set them up to be ridiculed in class. They typically won't answer, and they're the silent ones in the class, and yet as is often the case, you find that they have some really interesting ideas if they're given an outlet, and that's usually in the form of writing or some type of more private assignment. So we can use Google Forms to kind of capitalize on that by setting up a survey and letting that survey serve as the starting point for our discussion. So that's what I did here with my French 3 class survey. So I've got the basic stuff in here. Notice again I turned off the Pequot Lakes Public Schools login because the kids have a different domain. You want to make sure that that's off, or they're going to need to contact you for permission, which is going to slow it way down if you're trying to do this in class. But here in the instructions, you notice that I put on here your answers are anonymous. It's an important thing to emphasize with kids over and over, that we're not collecting, for this type of activity anyways, we're not collecting information, therefore they can be honest. And what I did here is I set up 3 questions based on an imaginary unit that I was doing on the French Revolution. And you'll notice from the very first question here, what was the true cause of the French Revolution? Immediately bells and whistles go off in our adult brain with that word true, because it's very difficult. But this was very intentional on my part, because these types of questions where you use only true, where you speak in absolutes, are something that kids latch on to right away, and those are also the things that get discussions going, because it allows kids to jump in with their natural reaction, which is I'm right, you're wrong, and then you take that passion and you kind of use it to funnel it into a discussion where you start talking about how things are very seldom in absolutes and always kind of in shades of gray. So I try to set up questions that are absolutes to get kids to respond, because it'll be their first indication is going to be, oh well, I'm going to respond because this is right, this is the right answer, and it's a little bit of a ploy to to get them to try to support that answer later on. Also, which of the following were victims? Victims, again, is another kind of dangerous term, I guess, in the question, in the sense that if you know anything about the French Revolution, you'll know that Marie Antoinette had famously said, or was purported to say, "Let them eat cake," as millions were starving outside. And when in all actuality that likely didn't happen. It's interesting, and will be interesting for students, that I put some of the likely villains in here as well in the victims category, in an effort to try to get kids to try to argue that they shouldn't even be on the list. And while nonetheless there will be some people that will select some of the villains in any story, and whether that story is real or fictional, and try to support that. So what I'm trying to show here is that when you set up something like this for a discussion, you want to try to get kids to get fired up about something, about an issue, a point of view, something like that. And even if it's fired up against you, it's going to be something that will spur discussion. Okay, and then you'll see here that for the most part I just have checkboxes, and I want to put in checkboxes because I want them to give multiple answers. If I were to bring in just multiple choice answers, they can only select one, and I don't really feel that that's as effective. The other thing on this question is I put in other. Other is always a great way to allow kids to give their point of view, which may be different. There may be other causes that a kid feels passionately about that weren't discussed in class, and it's a good thing to always add if you can. Down here I'm asking for more information because I want a justification. Now the question would be, well, why didn't we just put up here, make these all text boxes and make the kids type and type and type, and I'll show you why here in a second. But down here I do give them a longer example where I say, you know, if you believe this, justify it. Give us some examples from the readings that we did, what we watched in class, etc. Okay, and then the rest of the form is pretty much standard. One of the things that you may want to think about, especially in a survey or in a vote or something like that, is actually checking this box that in the previous video I said don't check. And the reason is that there's nothing collected here. It's not collecting information about the students. There's no grades involved in this. There's nothing like that. There's also no way for students to really look at this information and be, you know, figure out who said what and harass them about it or anything like that. And what this does is it publishes a link when they finish where they can actually see the information. And when I'm talking about seeing the information, let's go to the responses and see what comes up. So if I did view responses, what I get is a spreadsheet with all of this in here. For this type of assignment or activity, this isn't really useful for me because what I'm looking to do is spur classroom discussion, therefore I want to use it in class. So what I want to jump to instead of going and looking at the responses like this is I want to go back to the form, and instead of view responses, I'm going to go right to a summary of responses. And what I get is a chart. And this is why specifically I selected the checkboxes, or you could do multiple choice. You could also do a scale, you know, 0 to 10, whatever. Because those assign options essentially, or numbers to everything. So this is number 1, number 2, number 3, and it allows you to get numerical data back in terms of who selected what. So in this I had 3 total responses, and these were the percentages of people responding, and it gives me, you know, a graphic right away that's real powerful in class if I put this up on the screen. Because surprisingly, for instance, if I go down to saying that Louis here was a victim and he was the most likely villain in the whole story, kids will respond quickly to saying, "What? I can't believe somebody said that. He's the bad guy. He's the worst guy." Also, you'll notice why I didn't just do text. So down here, this is the text that they put in. You'll notice that it's just kind of all together and crammed together and kind of hard to read. This is why I try to stay away from a lot of text in this type of an activity because it's hard to sort through all of this. The reason that I don't get rid of it altogether is I can still take sentences from here, and you'll notice that the responses are split by just a little space of white in there. And I can use that as a starting point. So I can say, well, here, someone in class said that Marie Antoinette and her kids were victims, that it wasn't their fault because they didn't know what Louis was doing. And she never actually said, let them eat cake. And I could say, okay, is that true, or what do you think? And I can use some of those things. And I will try to intentionally pick some that are likely to spur some discussion. So for instance, this one down here about one of the figures in the revolution, Georges Danton, he was the smartest in the group in the comité. So again, speaking in absolutes. Now there's some people that would definitely disagree with that and would say that he was right to be killed off by Robespierre. There's another one here. If he had survived instead of Robespierre, the government would have started quicker. That's another pretty bold statement. These could be used as discussion starters to kind of prod kids into having some more discussion in class about some of the issues that this is obviously would be in a French class, or it could be in a social studies class, but this is really applicable to anything, because you could provide, instead of, if this were in a math class, instead of having the options be, what was the cause, you could be doing a demonstration in class where you're going over a problem and you're putting kids either individually or in groups to the task of solving, and you can give them possible answers, and they have to select which answer they came up with, and then you can look at the number of respondents that way. Another way that you could do it would be looking at the approach. So when presented with a problem in either science or math, what is the approach? So for instance, in math, what formula should we use to try to solve for this? And get some data back right away. These are the same types of things that are used for the personal response system, otherwise known as the clickers. But you can use forms in the same way, and it really only took me maybe 5 minutes to set up a basic form, and now I have this, and I have this information available, and I can clear out, if I go back to the form, I can go back and say I wanted to use this for another class and I wanted to get rid of all the information. I can go back and delete all the responses. Or I could also keep the information and say, use it kind of as a pre and post. So for instance, I give this out as the pre, and focusing on maybe this question with the figures in here, most of the students aren't going to know who these people are. They may know Marie Antoinette, they may know Louis XVI, they might know Robespierre, but they may not know. And it sometimes is interesting, depending on what you're doing, to be able to compare their responses after the fact and say, okay, well, what do you think now? Or maybe it's to present, opposing viewpoints on something, and present one viewpoint, solicit responses, and then present the opposite or the contrary viewpoint, and then solicit responses again, and have some discussions about how many people are responding one way or the other, and if things change over time. Okay, now the other option is kind of a check for understanding. And this would be like a formative assessment. It would be very similar, I guess, to the exit ticket that we went over in the first video. The difference being is that it's not necessarily tied to a specific learning target, and it's definitely not tied to a day. Exit tickets are an exit ticket, as in it's supposed to happen at the end of the class, checking for understanding for that class period's learning targets alone. Checking for understanding was a way that it can be tied more to the overall unit or a larger piece of material, and it's more or less like an informal quiz. I've set this up to track the student's first and last name, what class hour they're in, and then I've put some of the important parts from my instruction in here. And we were doing, this is French 5, we're doing an architecture unit. So we're talking about chateau, castle architecture in France, and also cathedral architecture. And I have some of the parts in here that I believe are really key, as in you got to know these parts, or when we get to the summative assessment, the test, you're going to absolutely bomb. So if I have kind of an ongoing checking for understanding, I can go back in here and I can change the questions and those types of things, and I can track for the kids how each of the kids are doing. If we look at the responses, we'll look at kind of two ways of doing that. If we look at the summary of responses, again, I have a text base. This doesn't really tell me a whole lot. It gives me, if I have short answers, major classifications of chateaux in France, the ancient and modern, these are shorter answers, they're easier to read. As soon as it becomes paragraph text, it becomes harder to read. So the summary isn't always as useful, but just remember that it's there. One thing it can be useful is if you're tracking the number of people responding. For instance, if you made it an assignment that every kid in this class has to respond to this by such and such a day, you can quickly look, and if you've got it set up so that they can only respond once, you can tell, okay, I've got 23 kids in period 2 and only 2 kids have responded. We've got a problem here. You can also at the bottom track when they're responding. So if you set it up over a week and you say by Friday you have to respond, likely you're going to see a spike here on Thursday night or Friday morning or Friday the period before your class, right before the due date is. But you're able to track in terms of when are those responses happening. And you can drill down that data a little bit as well in some of the more advanced analytics. Anyways, back to this is within the form itself. But if we're going back to looking at the responses, we want to actually go to those. So right now they're being held within the form because I haven't created it. So just as a reminder, I'm going to create this spreadsheet. I'm going to go to my drive. I'm going to refresh. And I'm going to click on responses. Now within here, this is where student information would be held, and you'll notice that it's student first name, last name, class hour, so on and so forth. This is where you're going to start seeing some of those same type of the same information we saw in the summary of responses, if I bring that up one more time. But it's going to be populated in the spreadsheet, and I'm going to be able to sort. So I'm going to be able to sort all of Kevin First's responses, and if I keep them over a period of time, like say for instance the entire unit, or I keep them over a period of like a quarter, a semester, I'll be able to track some of that stuff by his name, because within the spreadsheet I can sort and order things by any of the columns. And that includes date and time, that includes name, that includes class hour. So I can look and see which students in the class hour are having more difficulty. One of the other things is I had recommended in the exit ticket that you keep things anonymous to give you more honest feedback. You'll notice that I have student names in here, and the reason is that for these types of things, I kind of know my kids, I know them well enough so that I want to be able to keep an eye on their individual progress, and I also want to be able to take some of that information and share it with them, and also share it with parents on an as-needed basis. So this kind of is almost as a mini quiz, but you'll also notice that there's no grading associated with this, and that's because I have the text answers, and any of the grading that goes through Google Forms doesn't handle text or paragraph answers nearly as well. It handles multiple choice and those types of things, and I really want to give them a chance to write because it allows them to give me more information. And also, I'm just trying to track informally of where they are. Their real grades will come from the quizzes and the tests and those types of things, but this gives me information ahead of time to plan and say, oh, Kevin's going to have some real trouble here, whereas Olaf, he's going to be just fine. And then I can make some changes before we get to the quiz or the test to make sure that the students are doing all right.